Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India's unemployment rate stood at 6.1% in FY18. Official data showed, highlighting the challenge that confronts the Narendra Modi-led government. The data isn't comparable with that of past years. The government contended, in effect, seeking to refute previous leaked reports that said they showed the unemployment rate was at a 45-year high. The periodic labour force survey of the National Sample Survey Office released on Friday showed the unemployment rate in the country in FY18 was at 5.3% in rural India and 7.8% in urban India, resulting in an overall unemployment rate of 6.1%. The joblessness among males on all India basis was 6.2%, while it was 5.7% in case of females. Highlighting the difference between the PLFS and the earlier surveys conducted every 5 years, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation said the older assessments used paper forms to collect information on different aspects of the labour force. In the PLFS, information has been collected from all members of sample households using the computer-assisted personal interviewing method with inbuilt validation rules through tablets. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will decode the employment data and the way forward. Joining me on the program today are Ajay Dua, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Shishir Sinha, Senior Deputy Editor of the Hindu Business Line, and Praveen Srivastava, Secretary, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Praveen Srivastava, I'd like to start the program with you. Let's first try and understand and put into perspective the methodology used to come out with this data.
Well, this is a unique exercise for the National Sample Survey Office because it was we have been traditionally collecting data through paper schedules, visiting households and canvassing the questionnaire, trying to create a rapport with the respondents. And we found there was a lot of time involved in sort of not only collecting the data, but also processing it, vetting it, validating it, and then coming up with the results. Even though we had tried to speed up the results to get it out within a year, when you start a new survey and a new methodology, then there was a lot of experimentation that got involved in the periodic labour force survey. The first is we started using a rotational panel, which was not there earlier. So in the urban sector, we have a visit of the household and then we revisit it 3 times more. So there's 4 visits to a particular household. And when you go to the rural area, there's a single visit. Now the sample design was in such a way that the urban was visited on a quarterly basis and the rural was visited on an annual basis. So when you get all the 4 quarters data complete, then only you can compile the annual estimates for the employment and unemployment. The other distinction is that the survey that we had earlier was piled along with the consumption expenditure surveys. Now these surveys, the focus was on consumer expenditure, and therefore the stratification that you go at the ultimate level was based on the monthly per capita income, monthly per capita expenditure surveys. Now, when you change the stratification criteria, the results would be different. Now, if you look at the results in isolation, both are equally valid, but not comparable. So, statistically, both are correct estimates, but not comparable. And that's what we have been mentioning in the press conference yesterday. In addition to that, we use a technology, as you rightly pointed out, the computer-aided personal interviewing method, and that helped us do a lot of validation checks at the field level. Now, with this in mind, we looked at the data, we processed it, and then when we sent it to the committees to examine it, we found that there were certain issues that had to get resolved. So we referred it back to the Standing Committee on the Labour Force Statistics, and they submitted the report last week, and we released it yesterday.
So what you're suggesting is that the data that we have in front of us now is far more accurate this time around than in the past.
I won't call it, I mean, as you're comparing 2 incomparables, both are accurate in their own sense, but not comparable across.
Okay, fine, fair enough. All right, Mr. Dua, so let's decode the data now. What do these numbers really mean? Is there a problem? Is there, is there an issue at hand? How do we address it?
Without going into what Mr. Praveen Srivastava has said and explained, the changes in the methodology of computing, we're moving forward to the next stage, saying what exactly is this data conveying, and whether there is a message or a message being conveyed from what is. I would say certainly that if the unemployment is at 6.1%, even if the data for a moment we accept it's not comparable with the earlier one because it's a new series one, as Mr. Srivastava explained, fact of the matter is it does show, one, that this is pretty high, 6% over in any economy. If it is, in India earlier there used to be a lot more underemployment than unemployment. This is now talking about straightforward unemployment in the country, and much higher in the urban areas than in the rural. And second, the data also conveys that amongst women in the urban areas, the unemployment ratio is well over 10%, 10.8%, despite the fact that the labor participation rate of women is pretty low in urban areas, yet there is a high unemployment amongst them. For a moment, as I said, without comparing it with the past, I think in absolute terms itself, it shows that things need to be, job creation needs to be the emphasis, the priority of the new government. Having said that, I totally concede that it is easier said than being able to handle it, because there are a very large number of parameters to be addressed when you talk about creating employment in a country as large as ours, and where even with low labor participation rates, the number of people to be given jobs runs into millions, and whereas the population of many countries, particularly the Western countries, where we go a lot by this data, 2.8% has now become 2.9%, cause for concern, the markets plummet, and government call for stimulus from the government, etc., that we are talking about huge numbers.
Right.
So whether it can be created in the formal sector or more in the informal sector is something which we need to be talking about in this program as we go along.
Absolutely. We'll come to that in just a bit. But this issue that Mr. Dua raised, and let's look at the numbers a little closely. Shishir Sinha, unemployment rate among urban females is at over 10%, close to 11%. If you look at the same data among rural females, it is the lowest at below 4%. Yeah, 3.8. So why is that so?
First of all, we need to take the number of the participation rate that we call as the LFPR. So if you go into the go for the female, especially in all the area, it is 18.2 and 18.2, 15.9 in urban area, and if we combine it is 17.5. So if the participation rate is low, certainly the unemployment rate will also be low for the female. Now the most striking point is that in urban area and rural area, the employment rate, not the unemployment rate. Employment rate for the females seems to be higher because they are more engaged in agriculture related activities, and that is giving some kind of job definition or some kind of employment definition. In urban area, when you talk about job, when you talk about employment, people always say that it is 9 to 6 job or 10 to 5 job. So they go for that kind of definition, and accordingly they will disclose to the surveyor that okay, I am employed or not employed. But if you go to the rural area, if they are engaged in the agriculture or the rural related activities, they will say that they are employed there. That's the difference, and that is why the number of people employed, especially in the female category in the rural area, is much lower. Unemployment rate is much lower in rural area in comparison to urban area. The other thing which I want to highlight is that that data has been collected during the period July 2017 to June 2018, and that was the period immediately after the demonetization. So that was the real period of assessing what kind of job situation was there, because there were so many speculations that so many factories have been closed, so many people have unemployed. 8 months, but that was the real period to assess the ground reality. Now the problem is that even the 3 quarterly survey which was released along with the annual one, it is also showing very high unemployment rate in urban area, because these surveys were quarterly surveys only for the urban area, and that rate is between 9.7, 9.6 and 9.6. So 9.6 in urban area alone. That means the unemployment thing is still at a very high level in urban area. That is the real cause of concern.
Right.
Other thing is that what about the youth? Youth, as the report has defined, between the age of 15 to 29 years, and their participation is between 27.4 to 27.2%, and there the unemployment rate is also very high. It is 27.2%. There I think we need to think about that, whether the demographic dividend is working or not. I think the data released, the annual data as well as the quarterly data released, throwing these kind of questions.
Okay, so the numbers don't look very rosy, don't look very bright is what you're suggesting. Let me bring in Mr. Srivastav now into the picture. So you spoke about the methodology, you spoke about how this data is incomparable to the data in the past, but yet there are several media reports which are talking about, headlines in newspapers read, unemployment at 45-year high. What do you make of that?
Well, when we released the report, we gave a caveat because it's not that people will not compare. We understand that they will compare, and they've compared it, and therefore they come to the figure of 45 years. But essentially, if you look at, as I said, there's a difference in methodology, therefore they're not comparable. In isolation, both are correct. But go back to the earlier estimates of unemployment of 2%. 2% was translating to 1 crore people. Was that understandable, or is this understandable? In any case, what we're trying to say is that the labor force participation rate has been going down, no doubt, and you need to understand why it's been going down. In fact, the Ministry of Statistics has started a survey on the time use survey. So we'll actually be going to households to find out how they're using their time for all the members of the household selected in the sample. That'll give you a better picture if a person is withdrawing from the labor force, why, what is he doing? So you see, measuring employment and unemployment is a very complex exercise. You have the household survey approach, you have an establishment approach. In addition to that, we're taking the time use survey as well. So we've started a lot of activities, and when all these pictures come in together, you'll get a complete picture. Today is incomplete because we got only the household surveys. We're also doing an economic survey, which will be a survey of establishments. Now that's going to start in June, and we're trying to use technology in a very big way so that the results are out by the end of the year. Now with all those data coming in addition to that, we have a lot of administrative data. Now if you look at the data just from the EPFO and the NPS, EPFO has touched at least 2 crore people since September 2017. Now that's not a small number. Compare that to 1 crore estimated unemployment 2011-12, we have already put in 2 crore people touching the EPFO database, exiting, and mobility, that's another issue. But in this time span, you have got them into the formal sector. The other good sign which you see in this survey is that the employment levels for the illiterate is high. Employment levels for the educated, that is the postgraduates and above, is also high, both for males and females. So you find that it's the youth who are at the graduate level which are entering the market, employment market, for the first time. So there you have a skill gap. Now education itself is not alone, so you have to look at skills. Now the Skill India mission and all those things are working hard to find out what sort of a skill gap do I need to patch up to make the youth employable to meet the industry requirements.
Right.
So there's a gap between the two.
Sure, certainly. So taking the discussion forward, Mr. Dua, so what are the biggest challenges really as far as employment is concerned, and how do we overcome these challenges? Are there any specific sectors that we need to look at, skill development and so on and so forth?
Frank, please permit me to just take on first the point which Mr. Srivastav made just now. While I totally appreciate what he said, that the data this data is not comparable with the data which was coming earlier, I'll just draw his attention to the comments made yesterday itself by a colleague of his who was in the National Statistical Commission, and Commissioner Mr. Mohanan, who put in his papers when this data was not released. He's of the opinion, if I remember right what he said, that No, this data is fully comparable because it is meeting the basic test of any collection of such data or statistics, which is basically that sufficiency, sample size should be large enough, which it is here, 7,000 odd villages, 5,900 or 5,800 urban blocks, 4 lakh households being covered in enumeration, etc. So this is what the size was even earlier. He's also talked about being unbiased, which goes without saying, and as well as that the error margin. There are 3 requirements for any basic data to be processed, etc. That we should also provide for error margins. And he feels that even though we might have changed, as he explained it so well, that we have moved from the earlier consumption levels, the consumption per capita expenditure, to education. The explanation, since he was involved in the exercise, I'm just referring to him again, the acting chairman, he says that yes, what has been done is fine, but it does not exclude the fact that because 75% of the households only are covered by consumption, 25% are by education, 25% are still by the earlier criteria. So it is not excluding the people who were covered, and that in more than one way this data is comparable. I'll leave that for him to comment upon later. I'm just drawing his attention to that.
I think we'll get a comment in from him and then we'll move on. You can talk about the challenges. Do you want to respond to what Mr. Dua has said?
Well, very quickly, as I said, both are meeting the test of statistical requirement of efficiency, quality, errors. They're all meeting them in isolation. But then when the building blocks have changed, that's the only caveat that we have mentioned, that compare it with that understanding.
Right. Right. All right. Yes, Mr. Dua. Challenges and sectors.
Thank you so much. I think we need to be very clear in our mind that creation, and I'm coming with a little bit of background in industry in the state and the center for over a couple of decades in this, that the organized sector in the country is not capable of creating the number of jobs which we seek to kind of create. Because if we are adding 20 million people to the workforce every year, the entire organized sector itself is just about 35 million, what we have created in this country over all these years. So we cannot be looking for other than say a couple of million being added per year into the organized sector. The rest have to come from the unorganized, and in the unorganized sector, in the rural areas, it has to be agriculture per se, but more than agriculture, because we want to maintain the productivity in agriculture also of the workforce which is there. It is rural jobs, so that people get jobs there rather than they are migrating to the urban areas and reducing, everybody's job or probability of getting jobs and stressing the urban infrastructure. So I would think and in the urban areas, the jobs have to come from the micro, small, medium enterprises, not from the large industries, the ones who are basically assemblers.
Right.
Very few people in the large industry really produce goods, because they have to worry about standardization, they have to worry about quality, and they are the people who really are exporting.
So MSMEs should be the focus.
MSME in the urban areas is a job creator. The services which cater to the large industries requirements, whether it is support services like finance, insurance, or logistics, etc., they are the ones to create it. And in the rural areas, the jobs have to be found with, whether you call it, I consider rural solar energy in rural areas can be a very major catalyst for creating jobs. To create solar clusters. Right. Solar clusters will give you more electricity than today. You may have electrified the villages, but the definition is so restrictive that at one point of time, even if it's one electricity pole was put in a village, whether it reached a household or not, the village was deemed to be electrified.
Yeah,
now,
right.
you need to have much more electricity there, but if decentralized, and solar energy is capable of decentralized production.
Certainly.
I would think a whole lot of rural activities can be created once the power becomes abundantly available.
Right.
Your livestock, milk. We have seen the Anand example and others, how milk revolutionized the villages where this became not displacing the main activity, but an additional activity for the farmers, which separately for their wives, children, the extended families became the source of income.
Sure.
Those are the kind of things to be addressed.
Absolutely. All right. So, Shishasana, let's take the discussion forward now. If you look at India's economy, is the world's largest and fastest growing economy, I beg your pardon. So, as India grows, as India develops, the nature of jobs also change. So, looking at the changing nature of jobs, do you believe that we need a holistic environment, an all-encompassing environment, so as to ensure that more jobs are created?
Yeah, certainly, and I will take forward what Mr. Dua has said. When you talk about job in urban areas and when you are talking about job provided by MSMEs, we have three schemes. One is called Startup India, then we have Mudra, and another one is called Stand Up India. Can we combine these three? That will give a different perspective to job creation, because all these are working in silos. Stand Up India is working in silo, Mudra is working in silo, and then the Stand Up India is working. Can we link all these three together? Then if we go to a rural area, we all know that the plot size or the farm size has reduced. I mean, we have more than 86 or 87% farmers who are having less than 2 hectares of land. So, can we think of allied activities in rural area? I will give you an example of Sikkim. There is a village in Sikkim, I can't remember its name, but earlier they used to people visit those villages, but they were not entering into villages. They were just going, spending some time, that's all. But spending the night outside the village. One particular NGO recognized the potential of tourism in that particular area. So it developed a kind of rest house or guest house kind of thing. It installed solar operated facilities there. It provided television sets there. And now that village in one particular household is earning more than $100 per month. That's a good thing. That's a good thing happening. So there are a number of villages in our country, more than 6 lakh villages are there. There are a number of villages which can become a good tourist hub. They are good tourist potentials they have. So can we develop these kind of activities? Why we are just thinking about providing some kind of impetus to only agriculture? Why can't we think of providing impetus to other activities in rural areas where the potentials are there, youth can be employed and they will not migrate. The problem we are facing in urban areas is that so much migration is there that urban infrastructure is now needs to be relooked and there needs to be reorganized in a way, because the capacity which were created way back, now it's almost exhausted.
Not just that, we have to maintain the existing infrastructure as well.
So can we stop that migration? Rural areas have a lot of potential. We just need to have a blueprint, work on that, execute the plan, provide all kind of incentives. Believe me, that rural area will be much bigger employment generator than the urban area.
So the rural area can be a catalyst is what you are suggesting.
So.
All right. So. Closing comments from all my guests, starting first with you, Praveen Srivastav. Is there another way of looking at this data as a whole?
Well, I agree with what Mr. Dua was mentioning. When you change the definition of electrification, the data doesn't become comparable on the lighter side. Yes, so, the same thing here. You see, the challenges that we face in collecting data from household is something which is immense, which has to appreciate. Like when we get pesky calls on our telephone, how much of time do you address in terms of answering those questions? So, creating a trust with the respondents to be able to get accurate data is one of the biggest challenges, and we are trying to address that. We are using more technology so that data can be brought out more quickly. But addressing the issue of the declining labor force participation rates, some answers will be got from the time use survey. And we also have to appreciate that there are several studies I mentioned yesterday by the ILO which talked about a decline in the labor force participation rate, especially for females, when an economy develops and then it rises. So we have to find out whether at the rock bottom are we going to rise. So let's wait for the new data to come. And one more inkling I would like to give is that in the consumer expenditure survey, which was also done in 2017, we asked little questions on employment and unemployment. You would get some idea about that data when the results get released in June. So they may give you some idea, but not strictly as in-depth as this particular survey has given. It's very rich data. I would request all the users to please see it, dice it, make some sense out of it and tell us. Let's see how policy can use all that.
Absolutely open to change and open for feedback as well, and always willing to improve is what you're suggesting. So that's a very positive thing.
Just one more thing, if I like to add. See, what we have also done is in the field of openness and transparency, we make available all this data free of charge from 1st April.
Right.
So it's available to every user whenever they want, however they want. They can use it and give back insights to us.
Sure. Mr. Dua, closing comments from you. Now, is this going to be a never-ending process? I'm going to go back to your previous comment. You spoke about how there are so many millions of people coming into the job market every year. So it's going to be an issue of demand and supply, and probably that supply is not going to be met anytime in the near future.
Absolutely. I think we need to look at it now somewhat differently from what we have done. That what are the levers available with the government? One of it, to my mind, is government procurement. The government at one point of time used to give preference to small industries, saying 10% or 15% of government procurement had to be from small industries. I would say that now it should be looked at in terms of employment. The ones who create, if a norm for a particular industry is X, somebody minimum of X has to be created. He or she, or that it cannot be using highly capital intensive technology which is required for the export market or others, but whereas in the government system we could live with perhaps a more labor intensive activity, because government continues to be a very big buyer of a lot of items in the country. We would need to look at that. Second, I'm actually now referring to going back to this issue. I think we need to put it beyond doubt, both to attract foreign investment from outside as well as our own investments as economic activity, that the data which the government puts out is independent, is from an independent body, autonomous, and it might be the new series, fine. Take that forward, next one, but let it come from not a government agency by itself, but an institution which they create. And the National Statistical Commission, which had been set up some years ago, was actually meant to be one such body.
Right.
But we haven't been able to give it through, we have done it through an executive fiat. What is probably required is a legal basis to it, saying that what it releases has the stamp of government, but it is not released by the government, it's by a government body which is funded, chosen by the government, etc. But those people are given the autonomy which the experts deserve. Otherwise, we would see that what happened just now with this data, to two of its own members, including the acting chairman, putting in their papers saying that why we had gone through the entire exercise. If the government doesn't believe us,
so we should not see a repeat of that, is what you are suggesting. Okay.
Yes.
Closing comment from you, Shishasana, the best way forward.
I think we need to think more about manufacturing. We all know that services have very high share in GDP, almost 56-57%, and manufacturing has just 22, industry has 22%, manufacturing has 17 or 18%, and there was a target to take it to the 25%. Now I think we need to have incentive based on the employment creation rather than on the capital investment. If we can think about that kind of concept, that will be really helpful. Last to last budget, there was a promotional scheme to provide EPFO contribution from the government side, especially from the textile sector, and later it was extended to many other sectors. Can we think of same kind of schemes for various other sectors and also for MSME? Because there the EPFO says that certain number of employees, if the certain number of employees, then only you need to require that. But if we can say that even if you have just one employee, and if you are getting him or her registered with EPFO, we will give you this kind of EPFO contribution from our side. That will help in formalization of economy, and that will also help in getting the real data of employment scenario now.
Sure. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.